Hello everybody, here we are today talking about the Pittsburgh Penguins, whether or not they're on thin ice, and talking about whether or not we could see some major changes for the team this season or in the near future. So before we get started with that, please make sure to subscribe if you're new to me or hockey, whatever the case may be. Being said, let's get on into it. So Pittsburgh had playoff expectations entering the year despite the fact that they had made it in the past two seasons, and this year things are looking kind of grim for them yet again as they sit 3 points back at the final wildcard spot and have played 2 games more than the New York Islanders, the team that is taking up that spot at the moment. And on top of that, too, the Pens have lost 3 in a row, with 2 of those losses being relatively embarrassing, a 7-1 loss to Dallas and then a 6-2 loss to the Columbus Blue Jackets, kind of again hammering home this topic of whether or not the Pens are on thin ice, and in my eyes, they are. And there'll be a lot of things we talk about in this video that aren't going well for Pittsburgh, and right now one of those things are the goals that they are allowing and the rate that they're allowing them. Looking at this team this year, they have the second highest goals allowed per 60 or goals against per 60, and are getting outscored by like 20 goals at 5-on-5 play this year. Again, only about a quarter of the way through the season. Their goalies are struggling right now. You've got Alex Nedeljkovic, who hasn't really had a great go of things probably since his Carolina days. He's playing well against some of the bad teams, but against some of the good teams, kind of struggling a bit there. Joel Blomqvist, who is a young goalie, every time he seemingly goes out there, they're allowing 40 shots or more a night. And then, of course, Tristan Jarry, who had a stint in the AHL, and since he's come back, again, he had that most recent loss to the Blue Jackets, kind of highlighting, again, some issues there because Nedeljkovic and then Joel probably shouldn't have had big expectations going into the year and thought to have been those guys needed to help Pittsburgh go out there and make the playoffs. And it's not all on them either, too. Defensively, things like on their blue line, things aren't going well there. You've got Chris Letang, who's kind of struggling on both ends of the ice, but he's still getting a lot of minutes regardless. Then you have Matt Grzelcyk, who was brought over from Boston to help alleviate things defensively. That's not really going well there either, so you see part of your top 4 struggling, and then a trio of goalies that are struggling to produce as well too, with 2 of them really not expected to probably do a whole lot at the moment, Jarry being that guy that they really need to go out there and produce. But it's okay though, right? Because offensively there's going to be some relief, and that is not actually true here. As you see, this team ranks in the bottom third of goals. They are 22nd in the league for goals for per 60, and they probably are still in a situation where they are over-reliant on certain players to get the job done. Now, I do want to say that while we're seeing some of those guys produce, there's other guys that are producing as well too. Rickard Rakell is having kind of an underrated year, and you're seeing somebody like Anthony Beauvillier that has got 6 goals in this span, kind of playing at an over 25 goal pace. But in general, they're just not getting enough right now. This is a team that has struggled to score. They kick off the year in embarrassing fashion in that 6-0 loss, that shutout loss, mind you, to the New York Rangers, and they have 9 games where they've scored 2 goals or less in that span. They are really just struggling, and of course, too, their power play might be better. That's great, but in general, it's just not really enough, and I don't think things are going to change. They're not just magically going to go out there and start scoring, top 10 in the league at that rate or whatnot, but again, talking about this, it's not great to see a team allowing a lot of goals and then also scoring 2 goals or less fairly often, about 50% of their games. That is not a winning recipe. That is not something you can say is going to be successful for you to get to be a playoff team. So there's little room for error. That's kind of a given. But are we seeing a team that is going to see major changes? Certainly feels like that could be the case, as there are rumors that Sidney Crosby is basically the only one not on the trade block here. Then you are hearing Evgeny Malkin talk about how he wants to finish out his career in Pittsburgh, playing with Letang and, of course, Crosby. But right now, with the state of the team, things don't seem very stable, and you see a world where things could happen and guys might go out there and get traded. Malkin would be a very interesting piece here. He's under contract this year and next year, and his cap hit would be great for a team looking to provide or have an older guy provide some depth for the team, but also not be locked up to a longer-term deal and maybe get great return come playoff time. Letang would be one of those players you'd imagine would be harder to move off because I think he's got 4 years left on his deal and certainly is probably not providing the value that somebody would go out there and say we want to try and get an older player that could produce. They might not be looking at Letang and seeing a player that is kind of fitting that bill. Then you've got guys like Brian Rust that the team might say, let's go out there and get as much return on him as possible that we can right now. I think he's got like 4 or 5 years left on his deal. Then Rickard Rakell, again, another guy that you could see having kind of a good year right now. Team saying we would like to add a player like him. Pittsburgh might go out there and say, let's trade away as many of these players as possible and get as good of a return as we can to kind of speed up a possible rebuild or retool. And then we have to talk about, of course, Mike Sullivan, who we haven't even talked about at this point yet. He is a coach that we've talked about here on this channel quite a bit. He is a guy that at times I felt like has been on the hot seat, at times has been safe, But with this team not doing as well as they've done, even in the past 2 seasons, you'd have to imagine that he's going to be one of those guys that could be really on the chopping block, that could be out of there despite the fact that he's won 2 Stanley Cups with the team. And that's tough, but it really comes down to whether or not Sidney Crosby has more sway in this organization than we know about. Because I think Sid could really make a stand and say, I want to keep Sullivan, I want to keep Malkin, I want to keep Letang, and I want to try to keep this group together to the end of my career when everybody ends up leaving. Or you could see a world where either Crosby or the front office figures out a plan for the future where they say we can keep this team either at where they're at right now or ideally improve them in a rebuild or retool. And with Crosby just signing that extension recently, you'd imagine that he would be a little bit more swayed in this because he does have that long-term future with the Pens, knowing that they could be still playing competitive hockey in the future years. Although I do think right now that it would be an absolute slap in the face to somebody like Malkin, who's always had to play the Robin to Crosby's Batman in this. And it's just crazy because Malkin is a great player, a guy that's going to be Hall of Fame bound. And to imagine him just kind of being shipped off and traded away like he wasn't a franchise icon is really just embarrassing and frustrating as somebody that's not even a Pens fan, but understanding of the fact that this could be a reality in the coming weeks or months, that he could be in a different sweater. So it does seem like a lot of big decisions could be looming over the franchise right now, and it could be a very dark time for Pens fans here, as he likely will go out there and miss the playoffs for a 3rd straight season, but could see some of their favorite players go on to play for other teams, which is never an easy thing. I think right now that you might want to go out there and see this team play as much as you can before things kind of end, possibly. And it's just a very tough spot to be in, but Pittsburgh's been in this spot for a moment. They haven't been relevant in the playoffs since 2018 and are a side that's probably due for some sort of change. Now, do I think that if they went on a hot run here and made it to the playoffs that they would kind of ignore all this? I do, because in a lot of ways I think they've tried to cover up or tried to make this team's flaws seem a little bit less dramatic than what they've been in recent years. But in general, this is a team that isn't going to be doing a whole lot for probably the next few years unless they did a serious rebuild. So very tough for an organization that has been very good for a long time now. But yeah, it's just the way it is. They're on thin ice. It's time for either a hot run or for some tough decisions to be made. So anyway, what are your thoughts on the Pittsburgh Penguins for this year? Are they going to go out there and go to the playoffs, or will they miss for a 3rd straight year and maybe even keep the band together? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Also, please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Everybody stay safe. Have a great night. And you go with hockey, all right. Goodbye, Brigadiers and Brigadettes. This is your captain signing off. Have a great night.